It's now 11 minutes to 8.
Truth costs money and serious journalism is under threat. That's the declaration being made today by Tina Brown, former magazine editor and author, as she launches a global summit. It's in honour of her husband, Sir Harry Evans, the former editor of the Sunday Times. His 10-year campaign to win compensation for the victims of thalidomide is a model of journalistic investigation. Now a memorial fund is being created to help investigative reporters of the future. Well, Tina Brown joins us in the studio now. Good morning.
Good morning.
And let's begin with this slogan, if you like, truth costs money, and what lies behind that.
Well, we all wanted to make this point. My partners in this are Reuters and Durham University, Harry's alma mater. And the whole point about this is that what is our cost to society if we don't have investigative journalism? Think of all the things we're not policing. Think of how authoritarian countries are acting with further and further impunity. If we don't support journalism with good journalism, rigorous journalism, then there are no custodians of our society. There are no abilities to push back and to expose malfeasance. So it's a very threatening thing when journalism is weakened. There are now 363 journalists in prison around the world, and we saw what has just happened with Evan Gershkovich, the reporter from the New York Times who's been imprisoned by the Russians. A terrible thing to see that a foreign journalist, the first time in 40 years that the Russians have actually imprisoned a foreign journalist as opposed to one of their own.
And you see at the broadcasting award ceremonies that we go to, you see the toll of journalists who have been murdered, and it seems to increase year on year.
It increases year on year. So at this summit, which we've called Truth Tellers, the Harry Evans Investigative Journalism Summit, we are really going deeply into some of these platforms that are really doing inventive things to get great journalism out. For instance, there's one called Forbidden Stories, and their motto actually is you can kill the journalist, but you can't kill the story. And what they do is they have journalists in peril can upload all their notes into a safe box. And then Forbidden Stories has vowed to, and does, finish that story for them so that even if they are imprisoned or killed, the story will get out. So they're going to be coming, which is very interesting. And we have incredible people like Christo Grosev, for instance, from Bellingcat, who was the great Bulgarian blogger who who figured out how Navalny had that attempted poison attempt on his life. And they were in the movie Navalny, which some may have seen. It's a documentary which shows how Navalny was nearly killed by that poisoning. And of course, now he's in prison in Russia.
And for people who aren't within the world of media, why has this happened? Why are there fewer resources for investigations?
Well, essentially, our world, journalism, is under assault from many, many areas. First of all, there was the great digital disruption, in the first part of this century, when essentially the social media platforms really took content and didn't pay for it and sold advertising off it. So that really depleted the advertising model. Then there's a lot of corporate timidity, huge corporate acquisitions of media, and they don't like controversy. They don't want to pay legal bills, and they slash the costs on the news aspect of it. And then there is misinformation, which is one of the most frightening new aspects of our time, in which, the viral lies get put out and people don't even know the difference between truth and fiction, which is being exacerbated now, of course, by the rise of AI. So there's many, many threats on journalism at the moment, which is why we really felt doing this summit is such an important contribution, because Harry cared so much about paying it forwards. He was such a great investigative journalist himself. I mean, his Sunday Times exposed the cover-up of Philby, the spy. His Sunday Times campaign for 10 years to get compensation for the thalidomide victims. So in honour of him, it seemed the best way we could support journalism was to create a fellowship, which we have done, an investigative journalism fellowship with Reuters, who are embedding that journalist in their investigations department, and Durham, his alma mater, and finding every year, a young talent who can join the army of investigative journalists and have that support for a year. And then to do this convening in which we are really bringing together, celebrating, bolstering those who elevate our profession.
And it is a field actually where individuals can make a difference. A journalist, like a dog with a bone, can worry away at an investigation and make a real difference.
Without doubt. I mean, you see the phone hacking trials going on this week. I mean, this was all began with the great Nick Davis at The Guardian, over 10 years ago, when he first exposed the phone hacking in Rupert Murdoch's newspapers. So, yes, journalists make the most enormous difference, and without them, we are very much more in peril.
And there are more resources than in the days of the Sunday Times Insight scheme, Insight pages, when you think about the kind of technology that journalists can use looking at data in intimate detail.
Well, that's what a big theme, actually, of the summit was we're having a lot of journalists, like people like Christo Grosef of Bellingcat, who use this open source access and data scraping. And there's an outfit called Forensic Architecture, which does an extraordinary job with that, where they can actually find out so much more by using all of this very cutting-edge technology. I mean, probably Harry would have got compensation for the thalidomide victims much quicker if he'd been able to have a social media campaign to go after distillers who manufactured it.
But what do you do when you have sections of the public, possibly large sections of the public, who don't trust traditional sources of news? I'm thinking about the aftermath of the Donald Trump case. He's saying in his defence that, he doesn't stand a fair chance in New York, all sorts of things that he's saying, that his supporters will believe him come what may.
Well, this is one of the most pernicious aspects of our time. And of course, Trump was one of the godfathers of it, in the sense that for 4 years of his presidencies, he kept calling the press the enemy of the people. He kept saying that he would never get any fair coverage by the so-called mainstream media. And of course, his answer to this current case that he's just lost and has been made to pay $5 million in damages is, I'll never get a fair shake in democratic New York. And unfortunately, I think that will play with his supporters.
So what do you do to try and combat that kind of world where people will only trust news that they're being passed on to them on social media by their friends, by their family?
All you can do is be as good as the other side and better. We've actually seen this with the Russian journalists. I mean, what they're doing is they're sort of weaponizing media for the good. They're actually using, YouTube, all kinds of social media with enormous energy to keep fighting back. And the BBC now has, of course, a misinformation correspondent in the great Marianne Spring. And it's important. I think every big news organisation will have that now. And misinformation is now really a whole discipline in which we are having to fight back against lies.
Tina Brown, many thanks indeed. Summit begins today, the Sir Harry Evans Global Summit.
Thank you.
3 minutes to 8 now. Time for the weather. Here's Simon King.